Hi everyone, my name's Jenna. I work for SFP Works in the sales department, and I'm joined here with Mark today to try and bust some of the myths of equivalent optics, which I think are very misunderstood, and I think you'll only walk away benefiting from watching this webinar. So I'm going to be asking Mark some questions almost from a layman's terms for people who maybe don't have as much knowledge as the experts in the field do. But we're joined by Mark today, who is the expert. And yeah, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do send them through on the chat box in Zoom, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. So yeah, hi Mark, how are you?
Hi, hi Jen. Nice introduction. More importantly, thanks for everybody, all the participants joining us around the community. I think more importantly, I think from a from an optic perspective and third-party optic transceiver perspective, everybody doesn't understand the complexities and what they are and what you need to look out for. And if you understand how they are made and if you understand what they are used for, looking at the different myths will make decisions moving forward on your network upgrades more simple, and gives you some idea of what to look out for.
Oh, that's great. And like I said, I think it's very misunderstood, and a lot of people are ill-informed when choosing the correct products for whatever the needs are that they need these equivalent optics. So let's go straight into it, but tell us a little bit about yourself and why you got into the equivalent optic game.
First and foremost, I think what we need to state here is that I'm not too sure if all the participants realize that this transmission of the Zoom function or call is you're probably finding that you're transversing maybe 100,000 optical transceivers to get this presented at different points of the internet, as well as different points of the communication to get the Zoom conference on. So you may not know what an optical transceiver is, but boy, you better believe that the internet that we're using right now, the packets are transversing those optical transceivers in different networking, different network kit to bring you this live video, which is quite amazing. So I'm going to talk a bit about myself. I think the most important part is I was educated. I matriculated in South Africa. I went to Wits Technicon. I had a thirst for technical knowledge. I think the most important bit was that when I grew up, I always wanted to know how things worked. I wish when I grew up that we had the internet was in its infancy. Maybe I'm giving away how old I am. For anybody that is young, the internet is pervasive. It just works. Unfortunately, during my era, we didn't have the internet, and the first internet we had was dial-up modems to communicate. We had Gopher, we had bulletin boards, but more importantly now the internet's so pervasive, and we can even have a Zoom call like we're having right now.
Yeah.
I am possibly, I would say I am a gadget geek with passion for business and technology and the continent of Africa. I believe in Africa, and I believe that it's a great view of the landscape to be a South African and a proud South African. So I'm going to kick off. My first job, funny enough, was building PCs. So in the good old days, and this was the early 89, 90, I actually assembled PCs. So these PCs were actually, the analogy is pretty simple. IBM was the only manufacturer of PCs in the early days. They charged a premium for these PCs. And the analogy I'm drawing here is that, guess this spurred a market of what we call third-party PCs. In those days, it was called clone PCs. And what was born was the PC clone. So the IBM PC was copied. The IBM PCs were assembled. I remember assembling PCs for ICL in those days, which I was working for. And those PCs were destined for connectivity at Eskom in the early days. What the key about the PC was that it was a device that you could only connect to yourself, and you could do word processing, and you could run small games, etc.
Very, very simple, unlike today.
So the key there was, I was always wondering, how do we make these things talk to each other? So what my passion was, how do we network these things? And what I did is I researched how can we connect stuff. And in the early days, the natural progression was to move into a network infrastructure business or a sphere of work. And I said, how can we connect these things and share printers and share files, etc. And I got into, in those days, it was Novell. So Novell was an operating system, even before Microsoft, which shared printers, had user directories, and had security realms around it. So that's where my thirst for networking started. I believe that, well, if you want to be in the network game, why don't you join a company that deals in networking? And I applied for a job at Dimension Data, and I managed to get a job. I was a technical guy those days, and the need and thirst for knowledge of Dimension Data at that stage, Dimension Data in its infancy, was the only Cisco Gold partner in South Africa. They built big networks. They did the telecom network. They did all the financial institutions, etc. Dimension Data was the company to join in order to have a network with a networking background, with a view to grow in that company. I was fortunate enough to move around in Dimension Data. I started out as a technical resource. I moved into a pre-sales role, which sort of guided me into a role of becoming account manager. When I left Dimension Data, I worked there for 10 years. I was an account manager in the financial sector. What I found out, and I think what's important, is that any of these big deals that we worked on, always the Cisco accessories or anything that we required to connect point A to point B, transceivers, memory, cables, was always a big ask, because none of the local distributors at that stage had stock. And what came from there was my idea to establish some net. And what I need to say is that the SFP Works is a brand of optical transceivers that we distribute. So the SimNet was the company that I formed, but SFP Works is our brand of optical transceivers. And basically SimNet was formed basically focusing on Cisco accessories, and those Cisco accessories, funny enough, were cables, memory for routers, and cables to connect to NTUs and telecom infrastructure to make the internet work, and then optical transceivers. And the optical transceivers were all these little building blocks that you would use in a network infrastructure that you would require. And technically speaking, what would happen is if a project would be put on hold, which meant there was a business impact because we couldn't deliver the solution to the customer, which meant that people couldn't get paid because the job wasn't completed. So that's when I formed the accessory business of SimNet, and the rest is history. That was actually 20 years ago, and funny enough, we at the 20-year anniversary, funny enough, in 2020, so I formed it in 2000. I think the most important part was that, and this distinction needs to come here, is that Cisco didn't make their own memory, Cisco didn't make their own cables, Cisco didn't make their own transceivers. They were made by what we call contract manufacturers or original equipment manufacturers, which is an important distinction to make.
Okay, so you started SimNet, and obviously the brand SFP Works, and that brings us to a lot of the myths that people have. We come to the very, very first myth, which are they a sub-quality to originally manufactured optics?
Jenna, that's a very good question, and that's the top myth that everybody misunderstands. So equivalent optics or transceivers are made to what we call a multi-source agreement standard. This standard is based on how the fiber gets used, the type of fiber, how the optic transmits and how it receives. But in layman's terms, it's a spec designed by smart people. It's called the MSA standard, and this MSA standard is public domain, and any manufacturer of optical transceivers need to abide by it. So the first thing is the MSA standard, which is standardized. The second thing is what in the early days, the likes of the networking vendors, Cisco, HP, those days you had Nortel, etc. Big manufacturers made their optical transceivers to the MSA standard. To name a few, you had Agilent, you had JD Phase, you had Finessa. So these were big contract manufacturers that made optical transceivers. What then was done was Cisco's of the world, the HPs of the world's, they wanted to put a signature on that optical transceiver in order to make sure that you can purchase it from them, the original equipment manufacturer. So the original equipment manufacturer would provide an optical transceiver with a signature that when you plugged it into a Cisco or a Juniper or a Nortel switch would look for that signature, and if that signature didn't come up, it would the optical transceiver wouldn't work. So that's the background of what the MSA standard was.
A mission critical, I suppose, if one of the ports goes down. So are you saying that with this multi-source agreement that basically all optics are equivalent? They're all equal. They're all the same quality.
Correct. I think a discerning factor there is that all optical transceivers are made to a standard, but the more important bit is that they're made from a whole bunch of components, and the more important bit is that these components must be of a high quality. There must be a testing regime which is of a high standard. And what's transpired is that people in the industry have reverse engineered the encryption that the vendors do on the EPROMs in order to make that optic equivalent. So when you install that optic into a switch or a router, it's not going to come up and tell you that it's not an unsupported transceiver. In the early days,
you won't get any nag messages.
No, you won't get a nag message, and the nag message is one of those messages that comes up because the vendor believes that it's not an equivalent optical transceiver. I think the more discerning factor is that when you put in a SAP Works optical transceiver, that the Cisco device, the Nortel device, the networking device believes it's an original and doesn't come up with that nag message. So I would say that there's three components. The one is the quality statement. Make sure that you have chosen a contract manufacturer that makes for a whole bunch of OEMs. That's important. If you are making for an OEM manufacturer like Cisco or Zeta or Howie, etc., that quality statement's there. I think what's important is I get the SAP Works brand of optical transceivers from tier 1 providers in the Far East. I have 2 main suppliers I use and a third in Europe, but their quality and their attention to detail is of utmost importance from a quality perspective.
Okay, so then, I mean, we're talking about the quality and how they aren't seen as sub-quality. I think the next thing people want to know is, are they compatible? Because that's a big problem that a lot of customers have. 100%.
I think that what I alluded to previously, so the quality statement's great. We obviously need to include that the price is not going to be the same. It's going to be a reduced price compared to an original vendor or OEM. But what's more important is the compatibility side. So the compatibility side is exactly what I mentioned previously. You put this transceiver into a network switch. The network switch is an Arista switch. You want to put that optic into it, and you want to make sure that it's Arista certified. and you also want to make sure that it works in an arista switch. So typically speaking, there's two folds of testing. The contract manufacturer will abide by the MSA standard, and they would make it to a certain specification, which is top quality. The next component of it is the compatibility. Can it work in vendor X's switch with code X on it? And obviously at SAP Works, we have a test bed in South Africa. So if we test when the optics come from overseas, they are tested at the contract manufacturer first. When they come in country, we test every single transceiver to make sure that it functions in the correct hardware that it was compatible and programmed for. And the third step is we pass real traffic to make sure that there's no erroneous results. And part of that testing regime is to look at and I'm getting a bit technical now, is the receive and transmit levels and see if they inspect. So
it's basically a real life environment. I mean, when these things are tested, we're testing them in an environment that they're going to be put into, essentially.
100%. So that quality statement is the number one. Number two is the compatibility, which we delve in on now. The third one is it's tested in the platform that the customer will be using it in, which is important.
Okay.
So that's the statement, John.
The next thing that I think we want to look at is the original manufacturer supply chain issues that they have, which is what essentially sets us apart, because we can counter these issues. But what are some of the issues that we see with the vendors?
So I touched on it when I introduced SIMnet and why I started it. It was typically an accessory business. So typically speaking, the Ciscos of this world, the Arubas of this world, the Aristas of this world don't make their own transceivers. So when there's a big order in the system, you have to wait 6 to 8 weeks for these optical transceivers to be manufactured. So the wait times don't fit into typically the requirements of people's networks in South Africa or abroad, where I need to connect the agility of an environment where you've got things are moving at a fast pace. You don't have that 6 to 8 week lead time. The second one is that if you do the return on investment analysis of buying original optics versus equivalent optics, that you're paying a hugely inflated price for something that is equal and made to the same quality and standard as the original. A lot of the vendors also only give you a 90-day warranty. So typically Cisco has a 90-day warranty. The likes of Aruba have a year. Some of Arista has a year. But what they try and do in order for you to prolong that life cycle of the optic, so the optic effectively, when an optic gets put into a network switch, if it's going to fail, it's probably going to fail in the first hour. But longevity, the warranty length that SAP Works does, because there's no real risk for us, is that we have a limited lifetime warranty, which is important. So the limited lifetime warranty, if it happens to be faulty, we will replace it. But the key there is that we have the warranty length is more than what the original OEMs provide. And I think that also boils around our statement for the quality and the compatibility.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the benefits, I believe, aside from all of these things, shorter wait times, return of investment, our longer warranty length, I believe is stock, right?
Yeah, so that's an important statement, and I think that that's one of the differentiating factors of SAP Works in South Africa. We always have stock of fast-moving optical transceivers, and one of the most discerning factors that we do have is that we have local programming knowledge, so we can change a transceiver to become a vendor X, a vendor with some vendor X code, and then work in vendor X's switch. So we have local programming skills. So all the big network and vendor switches, we know how to code, and they make them compatible. So we will always have stock. I think what's very important is that in today's businesses, agility means that if somebody's got stock, you can move forward on your project. Deadlines always get pushed. We're looking at the current state of going through COVID, and we're looking at the supply chain. Cisco's lead time on switches, the same as Aruba, etc., has been prolonged because of COVID and the chip shortage. This hasn't impacted the network transceiver market or the equivalent transceiver market. So we will always have stock, and we have that programming skill which we can change the compatibility. And more importantly, we have the test bed to test that compatibility in said switch. So which I believe is a differentiator. And if we don't, some of the projects, we don't carry every original equipment manufacturer switch. With some of our key relationships with some key customers, we go to theirs on site and we make sure that the compatibility is right. If the compatibility is not right, we work on a solution to make the compatibility right if we couldn't test it in our local test bed, if we didn't have the kit.
That's really good. So, I mean, it's hard to believe that, yeah, people are still opting for more expensive options. But anyways, we come to the next part, which I think is less of a myth and more of a point that, you know, everything that customers need to know about taking advantage of this cost-effective option. And the very first point that people are going to ask and that customers are going to ask is, will network vendors provide you with support or provide them with support if they use your products?
So Jane, that's the niggling one that everybody talks about, and I'm going to state that the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, which is effectively an act based in the US, and a lot of these multinationals are based in the US. Europe has their own legislation around it. What they're basically saying is this optical transceiver was never made by Cisco or by HP Aruba. It was outsourced to a contract manufacturer. So this Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act at a 10,000 foot level states that the vendor has to support you because they can't, what they call is a tie-in warranty. So if this warranty wasn't, if the transceiver wasn't made by them, they can't force you to buy a transceiver from them. Now, I also realize that they've tried to counteract that by putting specific code on the optical transceivers, and we have a way to deal with the compatibility. But the legalities around it are that they have to support you. So, and I think what's also important, if you look at a network switch in an infrastructure, if an optic is found to be faulty, it's only going to be one interface that is faulty, and Cisco is obliged to support you. Each of the vendors that we deal with have their own way of dealing with third-party optical transceivers. I think what's important is the vendor wants you to buy the originals, so they can make a lot of money from a pass-through technology. And their fear, there's a format of FUD, which is fear, uncertainty, doubt, and that is based on, if I was working as a sales guy in one of these big organizations, I would definitely want you to purchase optical transceivers from me, because the end result is it's going to be my sales order is going to be less all the transceivers, which is a big issue from those organizations.
Could you maybe illustrate an analogy to explain this Magnuson-Moss Act so people understand essentially what it is?
Yeah, I think a good analogy would be if I buy a fancy car. Let's say I've got a Lamborghini and the battery goes flat, and we don't have a Lamborghini battery from the dealership from South Africa, they can't force you to put to replace that Lamborghini battery with a Lamborghini branded battery, because the battery wasn't made by Lamborghini. The same can be said about tires, and maybe a Lamborghini is a bit of an overstated car. So a person that buys a Lamborghini might want the Lamborghini battery, but a general car, if you wanted the battery, you could buy the battery from anywhere. If you look at that in the auto trade side, you have Willard batteries, you have a whole bunch of manufacturers that make batteries for all different cars. So they can't force you to buy the battery from them, and they have to honor the support of the car if it's under a maintenance plan. So they can't force you to buy the battery from or the tire from.
So if you do buy a battery that isn't that car's branded battery, they will still service the car if there's a problem with it.
100%.
Unrelated to the battery. Okay, and so that's essentially what the Magnuson-Moss Act is ensuring, that they can't not offer you support just for not purchasing their products.
Yeah, correct. I think the discerning factor, it protects the consumer. Yeah. So the consumer being the people that are using these optical transceivers, you cannot be forced by Cisco or the likes of HP, Aruba, etc., to buy their original optical transceivers. They have to support you with even they don't. Okay. I think this part of the webinar we discussing. So this is sort of like a networking strategy. So with the rand dollar and the exchange rate going pear-shaped at the moment, people still need to, and I think this is what I'd like to say. I believe I've probably dealt with Cisco for the last 20 years. Cisco networking, from a Cisco perspective, is that their network switches and their data center switches and their routers, etc. They are the best in the world. I'm not saying that if I was going to do a network build, it would be based on Cisco, but the more important thing is where I would be pressurized to save costs, I would buy equivalent optical transceivers, which will probably bring that price point down to probably 20 to 30% of the cost. So I think that's important. I'd like to get that out there. And then if you're going to try and change this, if you're going to, I think where I'm going with this is, if you want to tread the waters and you'd like to play in the equivalent optical transceiver game, we have a try and buy option. So you can evaluate all these optical transceivers in live networking gear in your environments, if they're big or small. If you're not happy with the performance, if you're not happy with their compatibility, if you're not happy with their functionality, we're happy to reimburse you. Typically, new customers that want to test the waters of this technology, the equivalent optical transceiver, like this peace of mind that these optical transceivers are equivalent, if not the same, to the original equipment vendor, and that's what we're trying to advocate.
Okay. Oh, well, that's a very good option to give people. They don't have to go straight into purchasing it. Okay, so I think we have, I've got a question here from, and for anyone else who has any other questions, please feel free to send them in the chat. But I have a question from Salvain from Saudi. He says, hi, Mark, do you deal with customers in EMEA?
Very, very good question. Prior to COVID, I had a drive to get into Europe, Middle East, Asia, and that initiative was stopped by COVID. But we don't have a presence there, but we can ship from South Africa into those regions. Happy to go through the same sort of process. If you have a requirements list, if we can chat offline, you can contact us at sales@sfpworks.com. But yes, it is a drive for me to break out of the bigger African region and South Africa specifically. These optical transceivers are light in weight, they're easy to transport, they're easy to ship. It's not like we're dealing with big networking Nexus switches, which weigh a ton, and the shipping costs are exorbitant. So yes, not a problem to interact with you and see what your requirements are. I'm also very happy to do a similar try and buy option if that's required.
Another question that I actually have is, and I was speaking to a customer the other day about it. If the networks are going to be updated, can they use those same optics that you've supplied and reprogram them again to something else if they've already been reprogrammed?
Jenna, very good question. So if they are SAP Works branded, which is the brand of transceiver that I supply, happy to. So typically speaking, when people make a difference, effectively vendors want to change their customers want to change their network strategy, and they want to go from vendor X to vendor Y. Very happy to reprogram those optical transceivers to work in the new vendor's kit for a small nominal fee for programming. I think the key is that you buying an optical transceiver, that the life cycle of that optical transceiver can change from vendor A to vendor B's kit. Obviously, with Ethernet's developments, if you were sitting with a 1 gig network and you wanted to move to 10 gig, you'd have to buy the 10 gig optics, or if you're moving from 10 gig going to 100, reprogram them depending on what you're trying to achieve. They can be reused, but obviously you'd be moving to faster feeds and speeds in that network infrastructure to provide connectivity for your new applications that you may be running on it.
Okay, so it's possible, basically.
Yep.
Going back to the testing that you spoke in depth about and how rigorous our testing procedures are, even with all the testing, what is the failure rate?
So because of that dual testing, so the contract manufacturer does their initial tests. When they come into South Africa, we do our second test. And the discerning factor is, I think maybe I'll mention this, is that probably 65% of the optical transceivers that I get from my contract manufacturer are Cisco coded. The balance will be recoded to other vendors, and that's typically the landscape in South Africa. Sorry, Jen, can you repeat that question?
No, just that the failure rate. I mean,
so the failure rate, obviously, because of that regime of testing, we've probably, barring lightning strikes, which are the copper optics, we've probably had, I think I maybe sold probably less than 0.05%. It's very small. Wow. It's very minuscule amount. And that is based on the supply chain. So as long as you're using tier 1 providers, they're using tier 1 chipsets for the optical transceivers, as well as the testing regime that we do, and our local knowledge of where these transceivers are going to be used in the environment, then it's key. That's what we're sitting on. So I don't like failures. Do happen when it comes to copper. That's typically a lightning strike, but then that optic will be replaced. But effectively, two things: it's the reliability of SAP Works that gets frowned upon. Obviously, we don't want a name out there that our optics fail. And secondly, your mission critical network, which could be doing a key transaction, fails. You don't want them to fail in your environment, which could be, if you were the JSC, if you were an online trading system, it could impact big events within your environment. Or if you're a service provider, there could be a major outage. We don't. I think that's the quality in the compatibility statement.
So Mark, I'm going to end off with this. Why do people still buy? We've established through this webinar that they really are the same in quality, and I would say there's more advantages to using equivalent optics as opposed to original manufactured ones. Why are people still opting for the more expensive option? Are they just ill-informed?
I think that's part of why we're doing this webinar. I think that the general, so understand that the networking industry is very small, and it's managed by a number of key players. And what a lot of people don't realize that these equivalent optical transceivers are identical from a quality perspective, from a compatibility perspective, as the same as the Cisco. And this is even more apparent when you move from 1 to 10 to 40 gig to 100 gig, that these optical transceivers go up incrementally in price from a Cisco perspective. I just believe that they're not being informed enough, and also realize that the third-party optical transceiver market has been around for plus minus 20 years. And people, or maybe it might be the original equipment manufacturers, vendors of the networking gear that create the FUD and fear and uncertainty, doubt within the end user consumers environment.
And I suppose if I think about personally, you know, if I go to the shops and I see something for a lot less money, it's much cheaper, I doubt the quality of it. I think the more expensive option must be better. And in most cases it is. But I suppose then today we've seen that it's not the case in the equivalent optic market. And yeah, I think it's more people, if only more people knew. Mark, I'm going to come down to just 2 questions that we've got in the chat. Another one from Sylvain, I hope I'm saying the name correctly. Does SFP Works, or can they provide demo on the specific product? I'm doing a 3-year project on new infrastructure on oil and gas, energy, etc. for Saudi Aramco. So
I think on a case-by-case basis, very happy to communicate and chat in more detail. When you're looking at the bigger projects, oil and gas, etc., what comes into that is iTemp, which is industrial temperature, because this stuff's going to be in the desert and in hot environments. And the optical transceivers need to be of industrial quality. So we do have access to those from our contract manufacturers. So I don't see that as an issue.
Yes, you can also provide a specific demo.
I think that the scale, it depends on what the scale is. It could be small, it could be big. We just need I need to look at the detail of what they're trying to achieve, etc.
So Sylvain, keep in contact with us. We'll definitely have to get more details from you in order to help you with or answer your questions in more depth. I've got a question here from Mark Elkins. Are your SFPs programmable? If I buy for Cisco, can I change the optic to look like one for another vendor if I change vendors?
So, very good question. That question is that in order for you to reprogram that optical transceiver, you need to have the password to write to that optical transceiver. So SFP Works optical transceivers, obviously, that's our key contract manufacturer. We know what that password is. Cisco, so Cisco branded ones, and I think that's maybe where the question is going. Can you change that to vendor X? Cisco, depending on if it's a Cisco Finessa or if it's a Cisco Avigo, those are the contract manufacturers that made those optical transceivers. One can possibly be changed, the other not, because some of those transceiver manufacturers have a hardware key as well as a password. So case by case basis, I don't advocate that I can do it. I haven't tried, but my experience is that possibly, but one needs to check.
Okay. Another question from the chat is, if the internet is down, can I blame it on the optical transceiver's quality?
Ooh, I think that's a open-ended question, and I'll answer that question. Hopefully your internet connection, depending on where it is, and I'm talking if it's a service provider that's providing you services, and your internet connection was critical or hypercritical, then you would probably have two internet service providers, and you wouldn't have one optical transceiver that connected to the internet. If the optical transceiver failed, yes, you would if you were a mission critical company, you'd have a redundant one. But the chances of an optical transceiver that has been in operation for more than a month, it failing all of a sudden, is very, very rare from a case perspective. But hey, we don't know. Maybe the switch got zapped by lightning and it affected the optical transceiver. So I would say by case basis, but no. If an optical transceiver is working, it doesn't get struck by lightning because it's fiber. The switch could get struck by lightning, or the router could get struck by lightning. So a very good question, but very difficult to answer. I would say if it was mission critical, you would have two links, and there would be two optical fiber transceivers connecting redundantly to two different environments.
So in the short, it's unlikely, but it would essentially impact your connection.
Yeah, no. You, obviously, if you don't have redundancy, if that fiber optic transceiver fails, and you buy it from a vendor or a third party supplier that hasn't gone through the quality control and the testing regime, etc., like we do, it may fail.
Okay. All right, Mark. Well, yeah, I think that those are all the questions that I have received. We'd just like to take a moment to thank everyone who joined us today.
Well, Jen, thank you, and from my side, thanks for all your time. I know that diaries and to get people time for, even though this was I think it's 42 minutes. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you joining, and more importantly, time is, your time is precious, and hopefully some of you have learned a lot about optical transceivers and maybe need to communicate with us and talk about it.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's something that I hope people are learning from, and will just speak to other people about it, because it just, like, my question was earlier, like, why are people still going for the more expensive option? And I do think they're just ill-informed, and this is where it changes, webinars like this. So thank you to everyone that did join and could learn something like this. And yeah, can contact with us if you have any further questions.